Well, welcome everybody to Author Chat. We are excited to be with you on this beautiful spring day. And we have a special guest with us, Kevin Clouther. Did I pronounce that right?
Very well, Charles.
All right, excellent. Kevin is the author of a lot of different works, including We Were Flying to Chicago, stories that were published by Catapult. His stories have also appeared in the Gettysburg Review, the Greensboro Review, Gulf Coast, J Journal, and the New Orleans Review, among other journals. And he's contributed essays to The Millions, NPR, Poets and Writers, Salon, and Tin House. He holds degrees from the University of Virginia and Iowa Writers' Workshops, and he is the recipient of the Richard Yates Fiction and Gel Residency Award. He's an assistant professor at the University of Nebraska Omaha Writers Workshop, where he is the program coordinator of the MFA in writing. So a lot of credentials that you bring. We're so happy to have you here for a great discussion tonight. Why don't we start out by having you tell us a little bit about what you're doing professionally at the University of Nebraska Omaha and what the program is like there.
Sure. So my wife and I moved out to Omaha just under 2 years ago so that I could teach at University of Nebraska Omaha and direct the graduate creative writing program. I sort of have two roles there. I teach fiction writing to undergraduates at UNO, and in directing the graduate program, we have a low residency MFA. It's the only Master of Fine Arts and Writing degree in the state of Nebraska. And so we have a core group of students in the state, and we also have students who live in states around Nebraska, mostly Colorado, Missouri, Iowa, Kansas, and we have students in the West Coast, we have students on the East Coast, in the South, we have students overseas. And so one of the really nice things about having a low residency program is we can attract students from all over the country, and they can come together at the Lee Lodge and Conference Center in Nebraska City for 10 days in July and 10 days in December, January, and do lectures, do workshops, see readings, and have this really immersive experience. And so it's really been a thrill for me to come out to Omaha and throw myself into this program. And my wife and I have really enjoyed living in Nebraska. Our kids have really taken to the state. And so it's been a very nice 2 years.
Wow, excellent. Well, I'm glad that you feel welcome in Nebraska and that you're comfortable here. Big changes coming to the middle of the country, but I'm glad it's treated you well. So tell us a little bit about how long you have been writing and how you got started in that and how that's evolved for you.
I think I've probably been writing since I was able to pick up a pen. You know, I certainly wrote stories and really fantastical things when I was a little kid. My mom kept a lot of those things, and I was pretty active all throughout grade school, but I didn't really differentiate among different arts. I was just as happy writing as I was drawing, as I was acting. It was only when I got to high school, and then to a much greater extent when I got to college, that I really found literature to be the thing that most interested me. And what happened was I read these books, these novels and stories in particular that just captivated me in a way that nothing else did. And for a long time I thought, well, the best thing I could do would be to try to teach other people about these novels and stories. And so I figured I would be a teacher and get as much schooling as I got. And only when I got to university did I realize that people were still writing books. It hadn't occurred to me that the books were still happening. And then I thought for the first time that maybe I could write something like that. And so I took a bunch of creative writing classes for the first time when I was an undergraduate. And the model that I was a part of then is really not so different from the model that I teach at UNO. You know, the students all read stories by one or two or three students a week. They all give thoughtful line edits and editorial notes on those stories, and then they sit around in a circle and they talk about how to make the stories better. And that's really a successful model, I think, at improving your own writing. It's one that I've been following as a student and now as a teacher for, I guess, over 20 years.
Yeah, I have heard a lot of writers say that that type of a critique group atmosphere is really helpful, especially when you have other creatives that are there with you if they're doing things well. And a lot of times those groups end up being really balanced from what I hear, that maybe you've got somebody that's really good at story arc and somebody else that's really good at character building, and they're able to really help each other in very important ways. Has that been similar to your experience with your groups with your students?
Well, I mean, the thing that I love the most about the workshop model is the real generosity of spirit that it elicits in other people. When somebody spends a lot of time reading and thinking about and then talking about your work, that they're really giving something of themselves to you. And I don't know how many opportunities we have in life to have those sort of interactions with a group of people. And in my experience, what happens is if the group is close enough and welcoming enough and vulnerable enough, people produce things on the page and say things in that environment that they didn't even know they were capable of. And so there might be a student who considers herself particularly good at characterization, but then finds that she writes dialogue in a way that never even occurred to her to try. And so students are, perpetually expanding their sense of what's possible on the page. And in that way, I find the workshop model really inspiring.
Wow, excellent. So we may have one of your students on, because we got a little message there that Kevin is the best. So somebody that knows you, maybe somebody that's been a part of one of those groups.
I think I must have planted that person.
Yeah, maybe. So as you think about, your inspiration to become a writer, it sounds like as a kid, really creative. You were into acting, into art and those types of things. What was it in those books that you were reading that you think really clicked with you and really made you say, yes, writing is the direction I want to go?
Well, the thing about writing, and I would say fiction, and in particular for me, is the access to other people's interiority. When I watch a dance or I listen to a song or I look at a piece of art, I can be moved tremendously, but I don't feel like I have access to another person's mind. But when you read fiction, you inhabit other people's minds. And, I think that the novel and the short story as forms have really developed over the last 150 years or so. And so when I read novels and stories in translation from Russian and French and Spanish and German, things that were written 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, from the points of view of men, women, adults, children, rich people, poor people, I'm just getting access to these worlds that I don't know how I would ever be able to access in any other way. And that to me has just proven completely addictive. There's no comparable experience. And so as a writer, the challenge is trying to inhabit an interiority in such a way that a reader will find it interesting. And I have all of these wonderful models that I turn to, and I'm discovering new models all the time because, of course, there is all this wonderful fiction that's still being produced. And I try to make an active effort to read both classic fiction and contemporary fiction, and to read a lot of fiction in translation so that I can cast as wide a net as possible. And it's really been heartening over the last, I would say really 10 years or so, to see the commitment on the part of publishers to try to bring in voices that were otherwise excluded from the canon. And so now in 2020, more so than ever, we have access to interiority that we've never at any other time in human history had access to. And I just find all of that exhilarating.
Yeah. So as you think about your experience with kind of exposing yourself with your writing and letting some of those things inside come out, was that difficult? And if so, how'd you get over it?
Yeah, I think so. I don't, and I see this in my students a lot too. Anytime I see a student who's really polishing and polishing and polishing a story, a paragraph, a sentence, I get nervous because that seems to me to be a defense mechanism against digging deep and really pursuing the stuff that matters. I know when I was a graduate student, I did that, and I had a wonderful professor, Ethan Kanan. He led the first graduate workshop I took, and after they workshopped my story, very honestly, very diligently for a good 3 hours or so, he and I met afterwards, and he said something to the effect of, "You're just not being honest on the page. You're not giving yourself over to the reader, and until you do, this isn't going to work." And I was defensive. I was thinking to myself, well, I'll prove you wrong. I'll just work harder. I'll just commit myself that much more. But what I didn't realize then is it wasn't about how hard I worked. It was about how truthful I was willing to be. And I say truth, even though I write fiction, I'm not talking about things that happened. I'm talking about an emotional clarity. You need to be honest about the way that your characters feel and process the things around them. And there was a distance between me, the writer, and the characters on the page that my teacher was picking up on. And so, ever since then, I'm more conscious of that distance. But there are still times where I can see myself focusing more on the craft and less on the emotion. And that's when I need to take a step back and really ask myself, what is it I'm trying to accomplish on the page?
Yeah, it reminds me of when I watch singing shows, and sometimes the judges will say, you're overthinking it, or you're getting in your head, and it kind of sounds like the same thing. Like you're so focused on some of the technical things that you don't let out what's in there. So as you're working with students and you find maybe you've got students who aren't digging deep, or they're having trouble, they're just overthinking it, how do you help them go down and bring out what they need to in their writing?
Yeah, that's a tough one because you can't sit down with a student and say, all right, you just have to be more honest, because there are a million different reasons why a student would be struggling to be as truthful as she needs to be to communicate what it is that she really wants to communicate. So there certainly isn't one answer. One thing you can do, and one thing I find myself doing repeatedly, is just reminding the student that that's what works, that all of the stories and books that the student loves because the author was truthful with the reader. So I think that's helpful, but I also think it's helpful to give the student space and to give the student time. You can't just expect to have a breakthrough on command. If you put in the time, if you do the writing 6 days a week, which is what I encourage, and you just put your butt in the chair and you make yourself do it, that's that's when you have the best chance possible of having a breakthrough. So you point to the works the student admires. You say, well, what is it that you like reading? What is it that moves you? And then you point out those moments in the story, the novel, whatever, that are really truthful. And then you encourage the student to put in the time, and then hope eventually, if the student cares about it enough, she'll get to a point where she's willing to reveal herself. But it may take a long time. There are any number of reasons why a student would hesitate to be vulnerable in the way that a writer needs to be. And so as a teacher, you just have to be respectful of that.
Yeah, very true. Well, we've got a question here from Lee. He is asking, what are the ingredients of a good story?
Right. So I could cop out and say that there are a million different kinds of good stories, but I'm going to actually give you a concrete answer. The three things that I look for the most, and that I try to impress upon my students. One is conflict. I don't use the word plot very often. I think that's a confusing word for people, and I think that structure can sometimes be sort of intimidating. So I think number one is conflict. And by conflict, I mean competing desires. So if you're thinking in terms of internal conflict, what are the two mutually exclusive things that the protagonist wants? So if you think of some of the great 19th century novels, two novels, Anna Karenina and Madame Bovary, they have the exact same inner conflict, which is a relatively young woman needs to choose between the adventure and allure of an affair and the comfort and stability of a monogamous relationship. And each of those novels, written in different languages at different moments in history, both wonderful, wonderful books, essentially have the exact same conflict. And then you have an external conflict, which could just be two different people want the same thing. You know, two different armies want to capture the same city, and that's the conflict of, you know, something like the Iliad. And so I think, number one, a story needs to have conflict. Number two, I think a story needs to have well-developed characters. I don't think those characters need to be people. I don't think they need to be in the realist mode. You know, fables oftentimes have characters that are animals or from the natural world. Sci-fi oftentimes has characters who are robots or fantastical or some sort of being very distinct from human beings as we know it. So when I say character, I don't mean human beings. I mean some sort of consciousness, some sort of interiority or human-like way of thinking about the world that's of interest to the reader. So number one, conflict. Number two, characterization. And then I would say number three, language. Nothing is more exciting to me than writing on the sentence level. So can the writer do something sentence by sentence that sounds different from what I've seen before? If a writer is really exciting on the sentence level, I don't care at all what the story is about, because the language itself is enough to keep me invested in the piece.
Yeah. So one of the things that came to mind as you were talking about character and using non-humans, one of the things that I've noticed, especially in the world of science fiction, is you'll take a non-human character to point out things that are either really good about human beings or maybe not so good about human beings. Maybe talk a little bit about your thoughts on using non-human characters to point out things about us as beings.
Yeah, I mean, I think pointing things out about us as beings is one of the best things that a story can do, and I think that it works best if the beings in question, whether they're human or non-human, are some sort of blend of good and bad. When I think about the stories that fail, not just stories that my students write or stories that I attempt to write, or you know, when I include, you know, in that group published stories, the ones that oftentimes aren't successful are ones where the protagonist is too virtuous or the antagonist is too villainous. And those sorts of stories work, I think, for children, because children are still forming their moral universes, but I don't think they're interesting for adults. And so if you have a character who's pointing out the flaws in a person, I think it's important that the story not just be a vehicle for some sort of philosophy or political position or worldview, that the characters who are being critiqued are characters who have understandable flaws. And one character whom I love to bring up in my fiction writing classes is Satan in book 4 of Milton's Paradise Lost. We all know that and understand that Satan's supposed to be a bad guy, but Milton writes his point of view with such sympathy and such complexity that to read book 4 of Paradise Lost, written by Milton, a very, very, very devout Christian man, to read Paradise Lost is to find yourself sympathizing literally with the devil. And that, I think, is what's key. You know, it doesn't matter who the characters are. It doesn't matter what the point of view is, so long as the people who are being critiqued or attacked are not just bad guys. They're not just wrong. They're not just vessels for the writer's worldview. They're actually people whom the reader on some level can understand.
Yeah, yeah. So we've got another question here. Who are your favorite modern day fiction writers?
So I think that in my lifetime, the greatest short story writer has been Alice Munro, the Canadian writer who wonderfully won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago, which came as a really pleasant surprise for a lot of people in the literary fiction community. And the thing that I revere so much about Alice Munro is that she basically writes one of two stories over and over again. There's a story about a precocious young woman in provincial Ontario finding that the world is not what she expected it to be, or there is a middle-aged woman, usually in British Columbia, dealing with a life trajectory that's gone different from the one that she's been on for the last several years. And to put it that way would be to make her story sound extraordinarily dull. But they're anything but. She makes that model work over and over again with the most wonderfully imagined characters and settings and stories. And I truly think she's a magician. Almost, I would say, the closest thing to Chekhov that we have in the English language. The smartest person I've ever met is Marilynne Robinson, who was my thesis advisor when I was in graduate school. And I think the depth of thought in her novels is unlike anything else in contemporary fiction. I don't think there's a better thinker on the page than Marilynne Robinson. And in that way, I would say that she comes from a line of someone like Herman Melville, where, you know, to read Moby Dick it feels like it's to read religion or to read philosophy, and Marilynne Robinson's like that too. And I'll name probably the favorite writer of my lifetime is Dennis Johnson, who passed a couple years ago. But I mentioned earlier the importance of sentence level writing, and I don't think anyone's written better sentences in the last 40 years than Dennis Johnson. He doesn't sound anything like anybody else who's ever walked planet Earth, as far as I can tell. And to read his stories and novels and poems is to just be in the presence of a true genius, someone who sees the world differently from everybody else. So I'll stop with those three.
All right, excellent. So I've been thinking about the interesting position you must be in as an instructor, where you've got these youngsters coming to you, and you probably see new writers falling into the similar types of traps, and you have to balance this. Sometimes you need to make your own mistakes to learn, and sometimes you want to give this advice to help people from falling into traps. Maybe tell us about some of the things you see young writers doing and how you balance that and how you help them.
Well, they're going to make the mistakes no matter what you say or do. So I don't think you have to worry too much about that. Yeah, of course. I mean, they fall into similar traps, just the same as I did. You know, I mean, one of the most common things I see as a teacher is the student imitating an author whom the student admires. And so when I was in graduate school, a lot of writers would imitate Lori Moore. She was so funny and so urbane and so of the moment that I could tell that people couldn't help but begin to sound like her in their stories. And somebody who is really influential now, whom I see a lot of my students imitating, is George Saunders. And he has such a wonderful way of picking up the rhythms of human speech. I think students find it contagious. They read George Saunders stories and they start sounding like George Saunders. Well, these sorts of imitations, imitating Lori Moore or imitating George Saunders, if we went further back, people would sound like Raymond Carver in the 80s, and going back, people, Hemingway sounded, people writing like Hemingway back in the day. I mean, I think this is okay. I think this is fine, because what that shows me is that the student is really invested in what she's reading. And so a very common flaw in stories that I see is that they read as imitations or knockoffs of some writer that the student admires, and eventually the student will have to get past that to be successful. But I think that's a logical and healthy stage in the student's maturation. And something I see in graduate students more than undergraduates is their taste gets to the point where they can no longer stomach their own writing. They've become so good at recognizing what makes a story work that when they look at their own efforts, they despair. And so that's the thing that I really, try to make sure that students don't get caught up in, that they don't get down on themselves, that they don't despair at their own ability, because that's another logical and healthy progression in the maturation of an artist, to elevate your taste and no longer be satisfied with what you're producing. You just have to do what I said earlier. You have to keep sitting down 6 days a week and working, keep reading, and then eventually, over time, you'll begin to form your own voice. I don't think it's something you can do consciously. I don't think it's something that you can deliberately put onto the page. I really like what the trumpet player Miles Davis said, that you have to play for a long time before you sound like yourself. I think that's true of fiction writing too. So you just got to put in the time, keep reading, and then eventually a voice emerges.
Yeah, writers write, and they don't always write good things necessarily, but as long as you're writing, you're developing that, you're building that muscle and developing and moving along. That's so true. So one of the questions that came in before the show is, do you have any writing rituals?
Yeah, they've changed over time. Before I had kids, I would do it first thing in the morning, when my head was completely free and unencumbered by the day's responsibilities. And that is what I recommend to people when they ask me. I tell them to try to write first thing before they check email, before they do anything else, because I do think that that's when your mind's at its most elastic. So if I can, I try to write early. But the biggest thing is to just make sure I do it every day. I write for 6 or 7 days a week, every week, and I write for at least 15 minutes, ideally longer than 15 minutes, but at least 15 minutes. And by making it a ritual, I'm not too hard on myself when the writing doesn't go well, because it often doesn't go well. I write slowly. I write bad sentences. I write bad paragraphs. I write bad stories. I write bad chapters. I have to throw a lot of it away. But if I know I'm going to be back at it the next day working on it, I give myself the time to fail. And I give myself the ability to be inspired, because what will happen sometimes is I'll sit down for 2.5 hours. I would say 3 hours is about the most I can work at a time. But I'll sit down for 2.5, 3 hours, maybe on a Saturday morning. My wife always makes sure to let me work first thing on Saturday morning. So from 8 to 11 on Saturday morning, I'll be writing. And sometimes those 3 hours I'll get almost nothing done. And sometimes I'll get a lot done, but I know that I'll have the next Saturday to work in that 3-hour window. And so there's not the kind of pressure where I have to produce. And under that sort of pressure, I think people oftentimes produce bad work. But if you give yourself space to do poor work, and you're not scared of poor work, eventually you'll produce good work, and you'll revise it and you'll make it better. And that's the stuff you'll send out. And I think that's really what works the best for me.
Yeah. So as I have watched different authors take their journey, sometimes there's a resistance, maybe is a good word for it, of they've produced maybe some fruit that isn't as sweet as it should be, and it's time for them to use that as kind of their university and move on to something else. But sometimes I see people get caught in, well, I need to keep revising this, and I need to keep making it better. But the problem is they've grown as a writer since they first wrote that, and trying to fix it isn't working for them. What advice do you have for people on when to determine that it's time to say, this was a learning project and I need to start fresh, and when is it okay to do revision and try to salvage something?
I think that's very perceptive observation on your part. And if I had a time machine, I would do a lot of things differently. But if I had a time machine and I could only impact what I wrote, I would go back into my 20s and I would tell myself to stop working on the same stuff so much, because it's exactly what you said. You grow out of the story, you grow out of the characters, you grow out of the language. That's a problem. And then another problem is you're not expanding your sense of what's possible if you're perpetually working on the same thing. So I think you have to be working on new things pretty regularly. The pattern I've fallen into is I'm at work on a novel. Eventually I get to a point where I don't really know how to make it better. And so I send it to readers. I have 2 readers from graduate school whom I trust. I have my wife whom I trust, and I have my agent whom I trust. I have those 4 people read the manuscript. And when those people are reading the manuscript, I work on other stuff. And maybe that's as short as a couple weeks, maybe that's as long as a couple months, but I do completely new work. And so what I've been doing is writing short stories while I haven't been working on the novel. New characters, new conflicts, different styles. And in that way, I'm always pushing myself to try to do something different, because as slow as a writer as I am, a novel takes me years and years and years, and I just don't want that to be the only thing I'm trying to do. And so when I'm not working on the novel, I'm trying different things. And of course, not all of it works, but sometimes you come across a style or a character that you like, and if you don't give yourself those opportunities, you don't know what you're capable of.
Yeah. So one of the things I think about often too is I look at different members of the guild, because we have a wide variety of folks. There are some people who would write for what I would call love. Like they have a story. Something happened in their life, or they had a neighbor they want to tell a story about, and they want to write for the love of it. And then there's other people who want to make this a career, and they want to write for money. They want cash out of this thing. Um, I'm sure you've worked with people that have those different motivations. How do you help people kind of realize what their goals are, and does the road look different in how you approach your work if that end goal is different?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot easier ways to make money than writing. I would steer those people into finance if that's their primary concern. In terms of writing for love, it really comes down to what the individual loves. If the individual fell in love with writing because of the Harry Potter series when the writer was younger, and that's certainly true, for example, for a lot of my undergraduates. And if that writer wants to work on fantastical stuff, then I feel like as a teacher, it's my responsibility to give them different kinds of fantastical writers and different opportunities to see what's possible within that genre, and then maybe that sort of help them to love new writers. If alternatively, you have a very earnest young man, and I get very earnest young men sometimes in my undergraduate workshops who want to write really serious, gritty, realistic fiction, then same thing. I'll try to give them some different kinds of authors, but I also want to make sure to understand what is it that the student loves about the work. What is it about the student admires about the work? Sometimes it's simple. The student got taken on a journey, and the student liked that trip and wants to go on it over and over again, and wants to take the reader on a trip like that. I think that's a great reason to write, and I absolutely encourage that. But there are what I would consider to be worse reasons to write, because they feel like they've figured out a formula, and if they can just master the formula, then it'll work over and over again. I don't know that I'm the best kind of teacher for that sort of student. There are good teachers for those sorts of students, but I don't know that I am. I think that all the students I've had that I've been most successful at reaching are students who want to write because they loved the stories they read. And so as a teacher, my job is to figure out what it is they loved about the stories, give them more stories like that, and then try to encourage them in the right ways and discourage them in the ways that aren't working on the page.
Excellent. Well, this might be a good time maybe to hear what you put on the page and have you share your work a little bit. I'll go ahead and mute myself, and you can read a selection for us, and then we'll come back together.
Okay, great. So I'm going to read from the first story in my collection, We Were Flying to Chicago. And the title of the story is We Were Flying to Chicago. And the story's told in the first person plural, which is a little unusual. It's certainly the only story that I've written in this mode, but it just sort of came to me, and I kept with it. And so if it sounds a little different in terms of point of view, that's why. It is a sort of unusual POV. For no good reason, we were flying to Chicago. Our connecting flight had already left, and there was no hope of another that night. The flight attendant was a cruel sentinel. Stubbornly unattractive, she skulked in the corner, preemptively dismissing the complaints we all were thinking. It goes without saying that every one of us hated her, and she hated every one of us. Once upon a time, men looked up from their newspapers and reports to notice her, but nobody did now, and for that she couldn't forgive us. We didn't blame her. We blamed the mute pilot. We blamed the pitiless thunderstorms. Mostly we blamed Chicago. It was a city we had no interest in seeing. Nobody could even understand why we were going there. We had been tricked. It wasn't on the way. It was embarrassing. We didn't mention it. More than most, the babies realized what was happening. They had no patience for such a pointless exercise. Their cries said, "Explain your intentions." Youth is such an advantage. We felt overmatched. We buried ourselves deeper into the handheld devices we weren't supposed to be using. If the plane crashed, it would be our fault. The flight attendant had already implied as much. Quietly, a woman began to cry. The woman's husband gripped her convulsing shoulders. He was grateful for the direction. An enormous man shuffling to the bathroom looked at them with soft recognition. He had held a woman this way, though not in many years. Her father just passed away, the husband whispered, but it wasn't true. Earlier, the flight attendant had listed the enormous man's responsibilities. He was sitting in an exit row out of physical necessity. There were many responsibilities, and he wasn't listening to any of them. In the event of an accident, I am saving myself, he finally told her. I am getting off this plane as soon as humanly possible and not looking back, so long as my directions are understood, the flight attendant said. The in-flight magazine made the airports look like enormous spiders. That wasn't right exactly, but there was something spidery about them. We landed in one leg, and the connecting flight took off in another. Not that it mattered. That plane would be gone by the time we arrived. When we deplaned, we would go straight to the counter, where a tired woman would explain what we already knew. We had no plane. We would spend the night in Chicago. Unless the woman had left with our connecting flight, we didn't know what would happen then. We didn't want to fight her. We recognized this wasn't her fault. There was only so much she controlled, but we had to blame somebody. The pilot wouldn't speak to us. Our calls, whenever we landed, would go unanswered. The flight attendant already hated us. We'd come to fear her. What would happen to us in Chicago? Would the flight attendant follow us to the hotel? If there was no woman at the counter, there would be no hotel. We'd camp in the terminal, our heads and legs dangling miserably from unmovable chairs. We were so uncomfortable already. We returned the magazine to the leathery pouch. Like everyone, we had been fascinated by kangaroos. As children, we dreamt of being carried in their warm pouches. It seemed a superior way to travel. It wasn't long before the in-flight magazine was in our lap again. We traced blue parabolas from Los Angeles and Dallas and Atlanta to Chicago. We didn't know why Atlanta deserved so much attention. We couldn't name a single thing about Atlanta outside of its sports teams, outside of its having burned during the Civil War. We didn't know who burned it or why. Hadn't Chicago also burned? It used to be a different place. We couldn't help but think, somehow, that it was better before the fire. Truthfully, we didn't like going anywhere. Flying had become so unpleasant. It wasn't just security. Everyone shared our complaints. It started with parking, which we didn't want to get into because who wants to hear someone complain about parking? Who wants to hear someone complain about standing in line? Nobody, starting with us. We wanted a lot of things. To smoke cigarettes and not get emphysema. To eat baguettes and not get fat. To be where we were going and not Chicago. The kids had the plastic trays down, and they were drawing. They were allowed to have the trays down because the plane wasn't moving. Most of them were drawing on paper, but some were drawing right on the tray. We didn't discourage it. Most drew planes in various stages of tragedy, yellow flames bursting from the wings, black smoke darkening an otherwise white sky. The windows were shrieking circles. We didn't ask questions. In fourth grade, the boys drew corporate logos in between assignments in art class. The teacher, an unreformable hippie, must have harbored grave fears about our generation. The boys drew outsized swooshes and colored them bright red. The boys wrote Nike Air and compared scripts. We fantasized about painting murals on school walls of heroic women slam dunking basketballs. The closest we'd been to Chicago was Michigan. It was easy to love Michigan in the summer. It wasn't too hot, and there were lakes for when it was. Snakes slipped in and out of the lakes, which surprised us, but not in a way that discouraged us from hurling our bodies into the water. It was so cold before it was warm. The boys were different, probably because we didn't know them. It was easy to imagine they were everything the boys from home were not. These boys were so easy to love. Their hair kept all the best things from the water. These boys were not at all concerned by the sun that clung to their naked shoulders. They didn't have to be handsome, which they realized. We knew they weren't this way around the girls they knew, but that didn't matter. We weren't this way around the boys we knew either. It was one of those things that doesn't make any more sense the more you think about it. We slept in open-windowed cabins. Our beds were so small and so hard. The sheets contained no softness. There were invisible insects everywhere. They zoomed up our nostrils and roared in our ears. We swatted at them unsuccessfully. We whispered conspiratorially about triumphs we were sure would never happen. We etched other people's initials into the wooden walls behind us. There were spearheads buried deep beneath us, but we didn't know how to reach them. We thought about treasure every time our bare feet shuffled across the dusty floor. We were desperate to remove the floorboards and make important discoveries. Crickets called to each other until we fell asleep, and in the morning, tiny birds filled the trees above our pillows. We learned archery, but our successes were random. Aiming had little effect on the weapon's trajectory. We learned to start fires and patch leaking canoes. Everything in our backpacks was essential. We were more interested in the narrow forest around us. It seemed fitting that danger should lurk there. We imagined limping men with weapons more powerful than arrows and pocket knives. It was important that the men have several attractive victims. We were required to learn the name of every tree in the forest, and even today, we find ourselves silently going through them in the midst of some mindless errand. We don't know our husbands' phone numbers by heart, but we can list every tree in Blue Lake, Michigan. We wondered why we never saw other planes, why we never saw helicopters or even birds. Certainly not flying saucers, which we were desperate to believe in for reasons we had a difficult time explaining. On a flying saucer, at least, we wouldn't have to worry about sitting over the wing. Thousands of feet in the air with nothing else in sight, we only had ourselves to blame. We could have stayed. When we were younger, we didn't see the point in living anywhere but Blue Lake. There, our shames were private, and people liked us for the way we talked and what we did. Weren't we saying and doing good things? We were happy. It wasn't hard. The world didn't have to be hard. Nobody could convince us we were wrong. Big-hearted counselors, open your arms. More than ever, we need your warmth. We didn't mean for it to go this way. Promise us you'll never age. Promise us you'll never stop being wise, tall, confident, an excellent shot. Remember the best things about us. There was no reason to dislike us then, beyond our capacity for misery. But what did we know about that future? What did any of us know about anything, past what we could see, in black cabins, deep in the woods, trembling with joy beneath the breathing of sleeping strangers? The initial descent was rocky. The air turned warm. We felt like we were about to be sick. We unfolded the bag behind the in-flight magazine. We hadn't realized they still made these bags. It made us even more nauseated. We looked around to confirm everyone felt as sick as we did. The lights flickered before turning off completely. We waited for the pilot to deliver terrible news, but the speakers were silent, and the flight attendant sat calmly. If anything, the flight attendant looked a little bored. She looked like she could use a cigarette. We could use one. We wanted to like her. In New York, there had been a young woman waiting by security, her neck held up with colorful scarves. Everyone in line adjusted as if to make room for her beauty. No matter how vapid we become, how senseless our days grow, these girls still arrive at airports as hopeful as they've ever been. We should mention that some of us had been these girls. We applied red lipstick. The skin around our eyes was so smooth, but we didn't think about it. We thought about which skirt went with which blouse and which jewelry. Our jewelry was so cheap, and we weren't dressing for anyone. We were dressing for the thrill of being young, though we didn't call it that. We didn't call it anything. That would come later. Most things would come later. Then we could live on anticipation. Some mornings we leapt out of bed. Nothing hurt, so we felt it all. We couldn't wait to meet our boyfriends, go to class, read everything. Chicago sounded like a magnificent place to visit.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for sharing your writing. Your style is very unique, and you took me places. Like, you took me to the plane where we maybe didn't like our flight attendant so much. You took me to those uncomfortable chairs in the airport, and so that's your hope as an author, right? That you transport us to those types of places. We've got a comment here by Bonnie saying that this has been super informative, and Victorine says, "Hey, nice job." I agree. It's been a really informative hour that we've spent together, and a lot of good things for authors to think about. As we get ready to part ways here, what haven't I thought to ask you that you'd like to share, or what wisdom can you leave us with?
Well, I just wanted to bring up one last thing, which is the extraordinary circumstance that all of us, every one of us, is living through right now. And people have been making a lot of comparisons to the Spanish influenza that started in 1918. But one of the remarkable things about that flu is that very little art came out of it. There aren't great stories and poems and novels from that moment in time. It's almost as though, as a people, we wanted to move past it as quickly as we could. And so, because I know there are a lot of writers who might be watching this stream, I really want to encourage all of you to take this time and document what's happening, because in the future, people are going to want to know what it was like. And right now, you have an opportunity. You might even have a little bit more time than you're used to having to put this on the page. And so do that. Take advantage of this time that we all have to write. And that's not to say that you have to write about the pandemic, but write about what you're feeling, what you're thinking, what you're living through. Because I promise you, people forget. We like to think that we remember things, but we don't. 99% of our lives is lost forever. But when we write, that's not the case. So this is a really challenging time for everyone. I hope that you're able to take some time in this moment to write.
Yeah, and my mind goes to the different perspectives that we have. I mean, if you've got more than a few friends on Facebook, you see a wide range of perceptions. And so by being able to capture those things and having lots of people capture those things that are in their minds right now, we get to see these different perspectives and know how life in 2020 is different for different people. So I think that's excellent advice. Next week, we are going to have an exciting show. Tosca Lee is going to be joining us. She's a New York Times bestselling author of 11 novels, including The Line Between, A Single Light, The Progeny, The Legend of Sheba, Iscariot, and the Books of Mortals series, and she did that with New York Times bestselling author Ted Decker. Her work has been translated into 17 languages and optioned for TV and film. So she's going to have some really great perspectives to share with Guild members and our friends and the public out there. So be sure and join us next week on Thursday, 7 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Mountain. And if you're enjoying these broadcasts and you are finding them helpful, and like Bonnie said, super informative, you can support the Guild by going to nebraskawriters.org and looking at the different membership options. It's a great way to support writers in Nebraska and really develop relationships with other people that are working towards the same thing that you are. And it's almost like a family. We're a diverse group, but we're a great group, and it's always great to come together. And I'm glad you were able to come together with us tonight, Kevin. I thank you for your perspective and your wisdom and the things that you've learned over the years, and wish you the best as you continue to work there in Omaha on your different writing ventures.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Charles.
You bet. We'll see everybody next week.